So this is Uncle Tech Sport, and today we have a review of a GPU, which has been a while. The GPU we're testing, that's the RX 7800 XT from ASRock. This is upside down. So in this review, we will be comparing the 7800 XT mainly to the RX 6800, this one. And the reason for that is that both of these GPUs have 60 CUs, or 60 compute units, which basically means they have the same amount of stream processors and all that stuff. So they're very comparable like that, even though this is an XT and that's not an XT. Also, this has 64 megabytes of Infinity Cache, while the 6800 has 128 megabytes of Infinity Cache. Whether that makes a difference, we will see in our benchmarks, but so I was quite interested to compare these two cards because of the fact that they both have 60 CUs. Of course, the 7800 XT is newer, has more memory bandwidth because the memory is running faster, and the clock speeds of the GPU is also faster, so it should be a decent amount quicker than the 6800. But both have 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and that's important. Anyway, the ASRock 7800 XT Phantom Gaming Edition. So this is a triple slot design. Well, actually, I meant a triple fan design, but it's technically 2-point-something slots, but it's basically triple slot. The middle fan spins in the opposite direction, which is pretty typical nowadays for these 3-fan designs. And there's some RGB on the front here. And I show you how that looks like in the dark. It's okay, not too fancy. And there's the plexi thing here that also lights up. I'm not crazy about the purple accents on this thing, especially not when you have RGB lighting. You know, you can choose your own color, but these will stay purple regardless of the color you choose for the RGB. So maybe they should have gone for something more neutral, but it's subjective. So maybe you like it, and that's okay. The card is a single BIOS card. It's no dual BIOS here, but you do get an LED switch, so you can turn on and off the RGB with a switch on the card. Okay. In my opinion, dual BIOS is not a deal breaker. I mean, it's a nice to have feature, but it's not a must-have in my opinion, unless you tinker with your card and try to flash the BIOS or something. Then sure, dual BIOS is nice, and it's a nice safety feature if you have to flash your BIOS for whatever reason. But I have the RX 6800 also doesn't have a dual BIOS. I've used that for the last couple of years. The 2070 Super in my girlfriend's computer, that's also no dual BIOS. It's been fine. It's not a deal breaker. If you need it, then you'll know. If you don't know what dual BIOS is, or don't know what you need to use it for, then you don't need dual BIOS. The card has dual 8-pins power connectors, and they are here's the heatsink and here's the power connectors. So the heatsink does go a fair bit beyond the PCB, both in this direction and that direction. There's a cutout on the back here for airflow. We've seen that on many of the newer cards. It could have been more cut out because there's still a lot of empty space. The PCB ends here. I don't know if you can see it, but the PCB ends here. And from here and beyond is basically just fins, heatsink. 4 display outputs, 3 display port and 1 HDMI. I'll have the version on the screen because I can't remember. I think that's the basic overview of the card. Very beefy heatsink, and 3 quite large fans. It's nice. Let's talk about performance. And when I say performance, I mean the performance of the cooler, because that's important. Maybe the only reason you watch this video is because of the cooler performance, because maybe you already know how a 7800 XT performs, but you don't know how the cooler performs for some reason, or maybe you're curious. Well, it's okay. I can show you the results. Just give me a second. So with the room temperature of 20.6 degrees Celsius, the core not the core speed, the GPU temp, edge temp on this card managed to only be 58 degrees Celsius, so that's very good result. Fan speeds that were just shy of 1200 RPMs, and at that point it's so quiet. I mean, I think it was 39 dBA I measured with the calibrated mic, and of course you can't go around and compare these results to other people who have measured the sound level, because you don't know what mic they used, you don't know what distance between the fans and the mic. So when I say 39 dB, in my case, that's very quiet. I mean, you can't hear the fans over the case fans, for instance, if you have those. Of course, I measured this on the open air test bench, and there's no case fans on that. So 39 dB was the fans on the GPU. And that's very good. Memory, that topped out at 86 degrees Celsius. Also good, well within safe limits. I have no complaints there. Memory temps was basically the same as the reference design RX 6800. There is an issue though, and that's hotspot temp. And of course, this might not be valid for all the ASRock Phantom Gaming GPUs, so I can't make the claim that all the Phantom Gaming GPUs have a high hotspot temp, because I don't know. I only have a sample size of 1, so bear that in mind. But the hotspot temp was 80, I think it was 87 degrees Celsius, and that's over 20 degree difference between the edge temp and the hotspot temp. That's a bit on the high side in my opinion, because keep in mind that this is in an open air test bench in a room that's 20.6 degrees Celsius. You put this thing in a case and up the ambient temperature, and you could be well into the 90s and maybe even touch 100 Celsius on the hotspot temp, and that's, I mean, it's safe, but it's quite high. If you compare it to the 6800 with the reference design 6800, the difference between the edge and the hotspot temp on that card is about 15 degrees Celsius. I do know that there's a different design, because now they are using these multi-chip things, and maybe it's tougher to get the edge and hotspot temp similar on those types of designs. I don't know, but yeah, hotspot temp was not a strong point on this particular card, but it was cool, it was quiet, and well, it was cool apart from the hotspot temp, and it was very quiet. So for 2024 we have a brand new lineup of PC games that we are testing, and some are new, some are older, and we have a lot of different game engines. I try to bring in a lot of variety. So we have, I think it's 18 benchmarks in total, 16 games, but 2 of those games are tested with ray tracing on and off. But then we have 8 ray tracing games, and essentially we have benchmarks for 8 ray tracing titles and 10 raster titles, although of course 2 of those overlap, so 2 of the games overlap. The test system, we should go over the test system, I suppose. i5 13600K, MSI C4790 Tomahawk motherboard, 32 gigs of 6400 MHz CL32, I think, maybe. I'll have it up on screen. And yeah, that's basically it. 1000 watts power supply should be plenty. Let's kick things off with raster performance, and we start with The Man Who Erased His Name. This game uses the Dragon engine, and here the 7800 XT did 104.5 frames per second on average at 1440p with frame times well controlled. This is a 19% increase over the 6800. That increased to 23% at 3440 by 1440. It's plenty playable on both, but the 7800 XT is faster. At 4K, the 7800 XT is 24% faster, but upscaling would be required to hit 60 frames per second on average here. Next game is Lies of P. Another Unreal Engine 4 game. At 1440p, the 7800 XT did 185.1 frames per second on average, a 21% increase over the RX 6800, which itself is no slouch, coming in at 152.6 frames per second on average. At 3440 by 1440, the performance increase over the 6800 is 23%, but both are more than playable here. At 4K, the 7800 XT is 24% faster than the 6800 and delivers the best frame time, staying above 60. Moving to another Unreal Engine game, Payday 3. At 1440p, the 7800 XT is 28% faster than the 6800, and as is typical from UE4 games, NVIDIA performance is strong here, with the 3070 delivering 91% of the performance of the 7800 XT. At 1440p ultra-wide, the 7800 XT is 24% faster than the 6800, but is almost tied with the 3070. At 4K, we fall short of 60 frames per second with 56.6 frames per second on average, 23% ahead of the RX 6800 and 10% ahead of the 3070. Moving to PUBG, yet another Unreal Engine 4 game. I promise I have games with other engine as well, even though that's 3 in a row now. The 7800 XT clocked in at 174.3 frames per second on average at 1440p, a relatively small 12% increase over the RX 6800. Moving up to 3440 by 1440, and here the 7800 XT leads the 6800 by 13%, and if we increase the resolution to 4K, the lead increases to 14% for the 7800 XT. Starfield is next, and this game uses the Creation Engine 2. Performance from the 7800 XT is good here at 110 frames per second on average at 1440p. That is 19% ahead of the 6800. At 1440p ultra-wide, the 7800 XT comes in at 91.9 frames per second on average, 21% ahead of the RX 6800. And at 4K, the lead increases to 30%. That's quite a big lead at 4K for the 7800 XT. Next up is House Flipper 2, a Unity engine game. Here at 1440p, the 7800 XT comes in at 106.1 frames per second average. By the way, we are testing with global illumination turned off. It's a performance killer in this game, so if you're struggling with FPS in House Flipper 2, turn that off. It doesn't really make much of a difference visual-wise. The 7800 XT is 12% ahead of the 6800 at 1440p. At 3440 by 1440 ultra-wide, that increases to 18%. And if we up the resolution to 4K, we fall slightly shy of 60 frames per second, but the 7800 XT is 20% faster than the RX 6800. Next up is Elder Scrolls Online, which is based on a custom hero engine. At 1440p, we get 196.6 frames per second on average with the 7800 XT, 11% ahead of the RX 6800. This is a very good optimized MMO. At 3440 by 1440, we still get 152.1 frames per second average, and the lead of the 6800 is now up to 14%. That falls to an 8% lead at 4K over the RX 6800. Ready or Not is next, and again we have an Unreal Engine 4 game, but let's move on. At 1440p, the 7800 XT is 22% faster than the RX 6800 and comes in at 130.4 frames per second average. At 1440p ultra-wide, we are down to 99.6 frames per second average at 25% lead over the RX 6800. At 4K, we fall just shy of 60 frames per second, and the 7800 XT is now 23% ahead of the RX 6800. Moving on to Doom Eternal, using the id Tech 7 game engine and using the Vulkan API, this game runs great. At 1440p, the 7800 XT delivers a whopping 322.7 frames per second on average, 24% ahead of the RX 6800, which itself delivers a very good performance. At 3440 by 1440, the 7800 XT is still able to pump out 249.0 frames per second average, resulting in a 23% lead over the 6800. At 4K, we still get over 144 frames per second average with the 7800 XT, and it is now 25% ahead of the RX 6800, delivering more than twice the performance of the 5700 XT. The last raster game is Forza Motorsport using the Forza Tech engine. When compiling shaders in this game, it only loads the 6 P-cores of the 13600K and not touching the 14 other threads, which means quite a long wait when starting the game, because it compiles the shaders every time. In any case, the 7800 XT delivers 105.6 frames per second average at 1440p, beating the 6800 by 18%. At 1440p ultra-wide, we are coming in at 96.4 frames per second average, 20% ahead of the 6800. At 4K, we still get over 60 frames per second in the benchmark at least, and we end up at 79.6 frames per second on average, which is a 24% lead over the RX 6800. Now let's move on to ray tracing performance, because ray tracing, that's becoming more and more relevant because more and more games are using it. Some games now even don't work without it. Or they work, but there's no option to turn it off. So yeah, it is an important metric, and that's why we have 8 titles represented here. We start off with Ghostwire Tokyo, yet another Unreal Engine 4 game. Ray tracing is set to medium, and at 1440p, the 7800 XT is delivering 82 frames per second average, coming in 35% ahead of the RX 6800. At 1440p ultra-wide, we still get over 60 frames per second on average, leading the 6800 by 34%. At 4K, we only get 38.3 frames per second on average, but that is 27% faster than the RX 6800. Next up is Deliver Us Mars, which is yet another Unreal Engine game. We are using high settings here with every ray trace effect on, and we are setting FSR or DLSS to quality. And yeah, NVIDIA stomps all over AMD here, with even the 3070 being 23% faster than the 7800 XT, and the 2070 Super outperforming the RX 6800. The 7800 XT though is 20% ahead of the 6800, but titles with a lot of ray tracing really is AMD's Achilles heel. At 1440p ultra-wide, the 7800 XT is just keeping its head above 60 frames per second at 61.2, and that's a 23% lead over the RX 6800, but again the 3070 is embarrassing the 7800 XT here. At 4K, the RX 7800 XT delivers 41.9 frames per second average, 26% ahead of the RX 6800. A painful showing from the AMD cards there, but let's see if they can fare any better in Cyberpunk 2077. So this game uses the Red Engine 4. Here we have all RT effects enabled, FSR or DLSS set to quality, and RT lighting is set to medium. At 1440p, the 7800 XT comes in at 56.5 frames per second on average, at 27% lead over the 6800, and a 13% lead over the 3070. At 1440p ultra-wide, the 7800 XT leads the 6800 by 32%, and is also ahead of the 3070 by 7%. At 4K, the 7800 XT is 36% ahead of the 6800 and is getting 31.1 frames per second on average. And here the 3070 meets a VRAM bottleneck, which means the 7800 XT is able to best it by 33%. Next up for ray tracing is Control using the Northlight game engine. No upscaling here, and all RT effects are enabled. At 1440p, the 7800 XT ends up at 61.6 frames per second average, leading the 6800 by 25%. That delta remains the same at 3440 by 1440, and we are below 60 frames per second across the board here. At 4K, we are below 30, just on the 7800 XT at 29.8 frames per second average. That means the delta to the 6800 is still 25%, and the 3070 is again choking on its VRAM, or lack thereof. F123 is the next ray tracing title, running on the Ego Engine 4. We have ray traced reflections and ambient occlusion enabled, and other settings set to high here with no upscaling. At 1440p, the 7800 XT is above 60 frames per second at 67.8 frames per second, a rather large 37% lead over the RX 6800, but it gets even bigger at 3440 by 1440. Here the 7800 XT delivers 54.9 frames per second average, besting the 6800 by 45%. At 4K, the delta between the 7800 XT and 6800 is 37% in favor of the 7800 XT, but 33.5 frames per second on average is hardly playable in this title. Moving on to a fairly fresh game, The Finals is running on Unreal Engine 5, and we are running with ray tracing static here, and the 7800 XT is getting 118.3 frames per second on average at 1440p, a 27% lead over the 6800. At 3440 by 1440, the delta increases to 34% in favor of the 7800 XT, which comes in at 97.5 frames per second on average. At 4K, we fall short of 60 frames per second with 58.2 frames per second on average, a 28% lead over the RX 6800. Now there's only 2 ray tracing titles left, and we start off with Doom Eternal with RT on is hitting performance hard, with the 7800 XT delivering half the FPS at 1440p compared to no ray tracing. 153.7 frames per second average is good and 58% faster than the RX 6800. I have no idea why it's so much faster in Doom, but it is. At 1440p ultra-wide, the 7800 XT is getting 123 frames per second on average, a 60% increase over the 6800. At 4K, the 7800 XT is still delivering over 60 frames per second average at 84.4 frames per second, which is a 65% increase over the RX 6800. And the last RT title is Forza Motorsport, and at 1440p, the 7800 XT is delivering 81.6 frames per second on average, a 19% increase over the 6800. If you move up to 3440 by 1440, the 7800 XT is leading the 6800 by 21% and coming in at 73.9 frames per second average. Finally, at 4K, we get a 25% lead for the 7800 XT, and the 7800 XT is able to keep the average frame rate over 60, but might not be very smooth. Average RT performance at 1440p then is 86.9 frames per second for the 7800 XT. That makes it on average 33% faster than the 6800 for ray tracing. A larger uplift compared to rest performance. It is also 69% faster than the 2070 Super and 28% faster than the 3070 for ray tracing on average. At 1440p ultra-wide, the delta to the 6800 is 36%. The delta to the 2070 Super is a more substantial 87%, and 27% to the RTX 3070. At 4K, the delta is 35% to the RX 6800 in favor of the 7800 XT, and the 7800 XT is also over twice as fast as the 2070 Super and 50% faster than the RTX 3070. Average raster performance then, that comes in at 155.91 frames per second at 1440p, and that makes the 7800 XT 19% faster than the RX 6800 and 81% quicker than the 2070 Super and 93% ahead of a 5700 XT and only 32% ahead of a 3070. At 1440p ultra-wide, the 7800 XT is 20% faster than a 6800, 95% faster than a 5800 XT, 80% faster than a 2070 Super, and 14% faster than a 3070. At 4K, the 7800 XT is delivering an average of 83 frames per second, making it 21% quicker than the 6800, over twice as fast as the 5700 XT and 2070 Super, and 46% faster than the RTX 3070. So then, performance on the 7800 XT is quite good. I wouldn't say it's a worthwhile upgrade from an RX 6800. I mean, you get about 20% on average for raster performance and around 30% for ray tracing performance. It's a good uplift, but it's not worth upgrading. I would like to see even better ray tracing performance from AMD in the future. Hopefully they can deliver on that. I mean, this is not bad. This is, I mean, I suppose it's bad compared to the 4000 series from NVIDIA, or 40 series from NVIDIA, but you can still use ray tracing in most games with this, with perfectly playable frame rates, especially if you're using upscaling. So ray tracing performance is acceptable, raster performance is good, and it has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which will help you in the future, I think, at least if you want high resolution textures. So compared to a 3070, I could take it or leave it for upgrade, I guess. You do get twice the amount of VRAM, and that's also worth something. But a 40% uplift in raster performance, and 30-ish in ray tracing performance. That's it's not a major uplift, but it is better, and there is less stuttering on this card. I did play Cyberpunk on the 3070 the other day, and as you play and the VRAM gets filled up, you do feel those slowdowns and stutters every once in a while, and that's not the case on this card, even with ray tracing. Compared to a 5700 XT or 2070 Super, this is a very worthwhile upgrade. Even, I mean, it bests the 2070 Super in ray tracing, it bests in raster performance, and basically everything else. So if you are considering upgrading from a 5700 XT or its competitor, the 2070 Super, I do highly recommend the 7800 XT, but you should probably also take a look at the 4070 Super, because that's has recently released, and it's quite a competitor to this. There's actually a 4070 Super in the computer right now. I'm benchmarking it right now, so that's the next video, probably sometime in the future, not too distant future though. Yeah. Power consumption. We should touch on power consumption. Total power consumption was about 450 watts with the 7800 XT running times by extreme. And that was, I think it was around 100 watts more than the RX 6800, and same for the 5700 XT. I think the efficiency, which is basically the power consumed divided by the frames per second in the times by extreme stress test, ended up at 7.9 watts per FPS, and that was 7 watts per FPS for the RX 6800. Of course, you also have to take into account that the RX 6800 is a reference design, and this is an overclocked custom model, so it will have a higher power limit compared to the reference 7800 XT. But efficiency is basically, it's not a strong point of the card, but it's not too bad, and as long as it stays cool and quiet, I don't mind it too much. If it had drawn 600 watts, that might be a bit different, but 450, that's okay, I can live with that. But yeah, also something to keep in mind if power is very expensive in your area and you game a lot. So power is very expensive here as well, but I don't spend like half a day gaming, so I'm not gonna notice another extra 100 watts on the power bill a couple of hours per day on average. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I do want to touch on overclocking before we wrap this up. So I went and overclocked this 7000 XT, and the performance gains are quite impressive, at least compared to what I'm used to with AMD. So the RX 6800, I could overclock that and I got an extra 7% performance, so didn't really feel all that worth it. This one, however, you can expect to see a 10 to 15% increase. At 4040p in Cyberpunk with ray tracing on, we saw a 16% increase in performance. At 3440 by 1440, we saw a 12% increase in performance, and at 4K we also saw a 12% increase in performance. So overclocking this card is worthwhile in my opinion. You do get a bit of extra performance, and it's the same in Raster as well. So to 10 to 15% performance increase from overclocking. If that's worth it to you, then go ahead and do it. It's worth it to me at least, and yeah, just to make sure you get a card with a decent cooler, such as this one, and you'll be good to go. Now let's wrap this up. I do recommend the 7800 XT if you can get it for a good price. I will also take a look at the 4070 Super, and I only have done a couple of benchmarks for now, and it looks pretty promising and looks like a good competitor to 7800 XT. So I would encourage you to go for the lower end models though, because the third party expensive models, the top end models, such as the Asus Strix and MSI Gaming X and those cards, they're usually not worth the extra performance that you get from them. So at this point the camera was out of power and didn't catch the last part of the video. Anyway, I just go on to say that I recommend the Phantom Gaming. If you can fit it in your case, it's quite a large card, but you should also check out the cheaper 4070 Supers. And if you can get 4070 Super for not much more than this card, then consider that. But if you can get this for close to MSRP or below even, then I do recommend the 7800 XT, and I don't really think you will regret buying it because it's a great card. That's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.